Welcome back to Old School Sports and to what has become an annual tradition on the channel here for us as we prepare for a new out-of-the-park baseball season. OOTP 26 will be released in less than 3 weeks if everything goes according to schedule. So what we wanted to do was once again take a look at 10 challenging teams to consider playing when the new version of out-of-the-park baseball comes out in mid-March. This isn't necessarily my list of the 10 worst teams in baseball, although you will certainly see a somewhat high correlation between teams that performed well last season, have low payrolls, didn't do much to improve in the off-season, and are expected to be bad once again this year. But we do try to do more than just look at all of the worst teams in baseball and put them on this list. If you're new to the channel and you find this interesting, would certainly appreciate it if you consider subscribing to the channel. And if you're one of our frequent viewers and frequent commenters, welcome back, and thanks for joining us. And since OOTP 26 is not yet out, what we've done is use our handy-dandy, trusty out-of-the-park baseball 25, and we've done a live start, which puts us at November 30th of last year. So these rosters are not all correct at this point. Obviously, a lot of free agency movement has happened between late November and now. It is Sunday, February 23rd, 2025, as I'm recording this. So while I don't claim to know every move that every team has made over the course of this offseason, certainly when we get into the 10 challenging teams, we'll talk about some of the roster changes that they have made over the past few months and why I think playing those teams could be a good challenge if that's what you're looking for in OOTP 26. And before we get into the list of the 10 challenging teams to consider in OOTP 26, I want to briefly walk through the criteria that I consider generally 5 key things that I think about when deciding whether or not a team is going to be real challenging. First, and probably foremost, is the quality of the roster. The Atlanta Braves, a perennial playoff contender, and one of the top rosters in baseball, at least according to the OOTP rankings, is going to certainly be an easier team to play. And yeah, we're just going to go there right away and talk about the 41-win Chicago White Sox. And you can see many starters on this team are ranked near the bottom of the league according to OOTP. And in the case of some of them, Garrett Crochet, they aren't even going to be on your Chicago White Sox roster for 2025. A second key criteria is to consider the competitive and market environment for the team. The New York Mets are a team with a huge market, good fan loyalty, and solid fan interest. And if you were to compare a team like the Mets to the Oakland Athletics, where we have a tiny market size, pathetic fan loyalty, and almost non-existent fan interest, certainly competing with the Mets is going to, all else being equal, be easier than playing with the A's. One of the other things that I do think about in terms of the competitive market environment is the resources of the competitors that you're facing in your division. If you are to think about the standings from 2024, and you consider a division like the AL East, the Yankees always with a huge payroll, the Red Sox look willing to spend again, The Orioles, one of the best young rosters in all of baseball. And the Toronto Blue Jays, despite a poor record last year, still a pretty big team in terms of their budget and a large market. That's going to make things challenging for a team like the Tampa Bay Rays that is just not competing in the same financial stratosphere as several of the teams in its division. A third key thing that I consider when deciding which teams are the most challenging to play are the finances and the ownership. And this certainly ties into the competitive and market environment that we talked about earlier. But if you're to look at a team like the Phillies, third highest budget, first highest player payroll in baseball, also some great market dynamics, and then ownership that is charitable in terms of spending, tolerant in terms of patience, and pretty balanced otherwise. That is certainly going to be a more successful situation to operate in most environments than moving several hours to the west to the Pittsburgh Pirates, where you're dealing with an owner who has a penny-pinching personality. And when you think more broadly about the finances, you've got one of the smallest budgets and smallest payrolls in baseball to work with. And as I think about the 10 teams, I'm not going to be going purely on the budget information from last year. That's here in OOTP. Have downloaded some information from SpotTrack on where teams' budgets are right now, and that's the type of information that, in conjunction with what's in OOTP as of the end of November of last year, kind of drives my recommendations and my decision making. And a fourth key thing to think about is the contract situation for the team. Who do they have signed? How long are they signed for? And how much are they signed to? And do we think those are good contracts or bad contracts? And these things can definitely change. I would still argue that the Atlanta Braves are in a good position in terms of some of the financial obligations that they have made. And a year ago at this time, I used the Braves as an example of a team that had set themselves up well for the future despite a lot of medium to long-term contracts being on the books. And I would still use the Braves as an example of a team with some of the very aggressive signings they've made of young players is potentially positioned very well for the future. But that being said, I have to be honest to it. When we look at the likes of Matt Olson, Austin Riley, Ronald Acuna Jr., Sean Murphy, Michael Harris II, even Spencer Strider, and some others, I highlighted, I believe, most or all of those contracts a year ago as deals that I thought were, on balance, really good for Atlanta. And pretty much every single one of those players had a off or down year in 2024 because of some combination of injuries and ineffectiveness. So this stuff does tend to change from year to year. But I do think the Braves have done a nice job of getting some good players in their mid to late 20s signed to contracts that should be pretty reasonable over the next 5 to 10 years if baseball continues to grow their revenues, and most importantly, these players remain healthy and productive. And as much as I'm going to be saying negative things about the Oakland A's later when we move forward, teaser, they are one of the 10 most challenging teams to consider. And I've probably had a fair amount of negative things to say about the A's over the last year, in addition to doing occasional tutorial videos or videos like this one. I also have a long-standing playthrough that I do every year in OOTP. and the A's are the team that I've been playing with in Out of the Park Baseball 25. So if you're interested in kind of following along the last month or so of that adventure and seeing how we've done with the Oakland A's, would love it if you checked that out on the channel as well. But back to the contractual situation, the A's don't have a ton of money to spend, and they've got a horrible penny-pinching owner. But if you start off as the A's, the nice thing is you really have no long-term financial commitments, and you have no significant financial commitments. So you're not going to have a ton of money to spend, but at least you're not going to be having to dig out of some of the poor contracts and long-term obligations that a previous general manager has left for you. And an example of a team on the other end of the spectrum by this contract situation metric is the New York Yankees. Clearly a much easier team to play than the A's overall, with a massive budget and a roster that made it to the World Series last fall. But if you're to look at some of these salary obligations on the New York Yankees, Giancarlo Stanton signed for several more years, already having some significant injury issues with both of his elbows this year. Carlos Rodon and that contract have not aged particularly well, although certainly hopeful as a Yankees fan it might be better this year. Certainly potential for the Aaron Judge and Garrett Cole contracts to get bad over the next few years. The Yankees have been exploring options to get out of the Marcus Stroman contract throughout the offseason and haven't successfully done it yet. DJ LeMahieu even has 2 years left. And when you think about some of the Yankees' offseason acquisitions, as excited as I am to see what Max Fried will do for the Yankees over the next few seasons, he is a guy who is headed towards the wrong side of 30 and has had injury issues in the past. And what that contract starts looking like out in 2029, 2030, 2031 is definitely a consideration. So a lot of things to consider as you think about the contractual obligations that teams have made in the major leagues. And the fifth and final primary factor that I consider when determining which teams are going to be more challenging is what their farm system looks like, and certainly use the minor league rankings as of the end of the 2024 season here in OOTP. But I've also looked at several independent resources to see where they have the minor league systems ranked as we begin spring training in the major leagues, because I do think that those latest rankings will likely help influence how some of these players look when the new version of the game comes out. But all else being equal, a team like the Colorado Rockies, with the highest rated farm system in baseball and 3 top 36 prospects, according to our friends at OOTP, will be a more favorable situation to think about than a team like the Kansas City Royals, who after a lot of great graduates from their farm system over the past few seasons is now ranked as one of the weakest farm systems in all of baseball, with, at least according to OOTP, no blue chip prospects. And with the introduction of my thought process and how I come up with this list complete, we will get into the 10 challenging teams to consider playing in Out of the Park Baseball 26. And this list is in no particular order. It's not 10 to 1. It's not 1 to 10. It's not alphabetical. I like to keep things interesting until the end. But since I've already teased that the Oakland Athletics were going to be on this list, and since they've been on this list every year that I put a video like this together, And since they were the team that I decided to play with as a great challenge in OOTP 25, I figured the A's would be an obvious choice to start with. Another poor season for Oakland last year with a 69 and 93 record. They're projected to be slightly better this season with an over-under of 71.5 at this point. But when you look at their roster, not very strong, and there's a lot of holes as we start thinking about the quality of roster. Now, the Oakland A's did add Jose Leclerc and Luis Severino in the offseason to bolster things a bit, which is positive. But getting into the competitive and market environment, we use the A's as an example of a team that is in a very challenging situation. And I think not even going to be playing in Oakland this upcoming season, although who knows with the way those negotiations have gone over the months and years. Nothing would surprise me at this point. As of the end of last season, the lowest budget and the lowest player payroll in baseball, according to OOTP. According to Spot Track, the A's right now are the number 29 payroll in baseball at $55.3 million, just ahead of the Marlins. But interestingly, despite that poor payroll, and despite the fact that the A's don't have a lot of salary obligations, they do have one of the oldest rosters in baseball, the sixth oldest at 31.4 years, according to Spot Track. So it's not a good roster, and it's an old roster. Ownership with the penny pinching John Fisher contributes to your difficulties in the financial department. As we talked about earlier, the contractual situation not necessarily all that bad, although there are a few additional contracts as we've talked about. And then the minor league system for Oakland, according to OOTP, ranks 27th and is one of the worst in baseball. A bit of a range when you look at the four rankings that we looked at preparing for this season, and those were Baseball America, The Athletic, Bleacher Report, and Fangraphs. According to those providers, Bleacher Report ranks the A's as high as 7th, whereas The Athletic has them ranked 27th, right in line with where OOTP had them at the end of last year. So between poor ownership, a low budget, awful fan support, and a weak roster, the Oakland A's are certainly a challenging team to consider playing in out-of-the-park baseball 26. A second challenging team to consider playing in out-of-the-park baseball 26 is the Washington Nationals. The Nationals coming off of a rough year, 71 and 91. Hard to believe that not too long ago this was a World Championship team. But the cupboard is relatively bare in terms of the quality of your roster today. When you think about that competitive and market environment, average market size, average fan loyalty, pretty mediocre fan interest, a low budget, very low player payroll, and ownership that is neutral, all things considered, when you look at the average ownership across out-of-the-park baseball. But you are in a very competitive division. The Phillies, the Braves, and the Mets are all high-spending teams that won 89-plus games a year ago with stacked veteran rosters, and you're likely playing the Nationals to be battling for 4th or 5th in the upcoming seasons. The contractual situation for the Nationals is not horrible. Steven Strasburg and that contract are finally gone. You did make a trade for Nathaniel Lowe this past off season to bolster the roster. The main contract you kind of worry about is Keibert Ruiz, signed through at least 2031, when presumably you won't execute an option when he's in his 30s. Average defensive player who has been well below average offensively for the past several seasons. You know, this was the type of deal that we were talking about with the Atlanta Braves, where the Nationals were aggressive in trying to lock Ruiz up early, but it doesn't necessarily seem like this has worked out to be a good decision for them. When we think about some of the real-life numbers for the Nationals, right now they rank number 24 in baseball with a $96.6 million payroll. Positive aspect for Washington is that they've got the second youngest roster in baseball with an average age of 29.2. And thinking about player development, they're kind of a middle-of-the-pack farm system. OOTP had them ranked 12th. Can see Dylan Cruz, a very highly regarded prospect. And they were basically considered a mid-range farm system by everyone who had them rated. Bleacher Report had them the highest at number 12. The Athletic had them the lowest at number 17. So everyone kind of agrees that it's a pretty average farm system in Washington. But when you look at the competitive dynamics in the National League East, a pretty mediocre farm system, and a budget that's not all that high, I think you'll understand why I think the Washington Nationals are a interesting challenge to consider in OOTP 26 as well. A third challenging team to consider in OOTP 26 is the Pittsburgh Pirates. Last place team again last year at 76 and 86, same record that they had in 2023. So I guess they have made small improvement from winning in the low 60s a few years ago. But a roster that outside of O'Neal Cruz and maybe Brian Reynolds doesn't have anyone all that exciting on it. They did re-sign Andrew McCutchen, bring on Tommy Pham to bolster the roster a little bit, but I don't think anyone's going to argue that it's one of the more talented rosters in all of baseball. Competitive and market environment is challenging with a below-average market size, pathetic fan loyalty, and low fan interest. You're in a low-budget situation, ranked 29th according to OOTP, but as of today, February 23rd, SpotTrack has them at the number 26 budget in baseball, $75.2 million, as we get closer and closer to the start of the upcoming baseball season. Ownership, you've got to deal with the penny-pinching Robert Nutting, which is always a challenge. The contractual situation, not a ton of long obligations, but two that could become problematic. I'd argue actually that Ke'Bryan Hayes is already kind of problematic. The numbers aren't crazy, but at this point, Ke'Bryan Hayes has proven to be a very good defensive third baseman, but someone who offensively is not very productive. Going to be 28 years old when the season gets underway, and he was a below replacement level player last season, and you've got him signed for several more years. Brian Reynolds and Mitch Keller are your other two medium-term commitments with pretty big money. You'll have to see what Keller looks like, an 11 and 12 year with a 4.25 ERA, a 2.3 WAR. Probably going to look pretty similar to how he looked this year in the new version of the game. And then Brian Reynolds, you just have to hope that he ages reasonably well he keeps putting up 120 plus WAR season or 120 plus WRC plus seasons and 2.5 to 3.5 WAR seasons. Not going to be a horrible contract, but it's probably not going to be a great contract either. Last but not least, the 20th ranked farm system according to OOTP. The recent rankings have them a bit higher. Bleacher Report has the Pirates the highest ranked at number 15, and Fangraphs considers them the weakest, ranking them number 19. So a middle-of-the-road farm system in Pittsburgh, and combined with some of the financial constraints, certainly not an easy task at hand if you choose to lead the Pirates. And this one may be a little controversial because there's some things to really like about this organization, but in my mind, a fourth challenging team to consider playing in out-of-the-park baseball 26 is the Toronto Blue Jays. Definitely a mixed roster situation. You've got Vlad Guerrero Jr. The key thing that you're going to need to figure out if you play as the Blue Jays is whether or not you want to and can re-sign Vlad Guerrero Jr. after this season and bring him back. Certainly would be a great bat to build around for the future. I think there's probably a better chance that you can bring him back in OOTP than perhaps the chance that he actually re-signs with the Blue Jays in real life. So maybe that makes things a little bit easier. The Blue Jays seem to be second or third choice of just about every free agent, at least according to the rumors. They're supposedly in on everybody, but when you look at what they actually did this offseason, brought in guys like Miles Straw, Andres Jimenez, Anthony Santander, and Max Scherzer. Certainly some big players there and guys who can potentially have a positive impact. But I think they were looking for more than that when the offseason began. Some of the things that do make the Blue Jays easier are the finances. Very big market, good fan loyalty, high fan interest, high budget team. According to Spot Track, the Toronto Blue Jays will be heading into the 2025 season with the fifth largest payroll in baseball at $232.8 million, behind only the Dodgers, Mets, Phillies, and the Yankees. Also have respectable ownership. But there are some big concerns in Toronto as well. Mentioned that what happens with Vlad Guerrero Jr. is going to be pivotal to how your playthrough goes. And then there are some contracts here that, while not necessarily incredibly long, could be problematic for the next few years. George Springer probably hasn't worked out exactly as hoped. And then they've got a lot of veteran pitchers, Kevin Gausman, Chris Bassett, and Jose Barrios, signed to pretty decent money for the next few seasons. If those guys all have great seasons in their 30s, the numbers that they're getting paid are not that bad. But if they all struggle and or have injury issues, you're going to have some pretty serious problems competing, because you're paying a lot of money to players that aren't that effective. And the other thing that's challenging about the Blue Jays is a pretty mediocre farm system. OOTP had them ranked 19th, but that's actually far ahead of where they're ranked heading into this season. When I look at the rankings, Fangraphs and Baseball America had the Blue Jays the highest at number 23. The Athletic had them at number 24, and Bleacher Report rated them as the 27th best farm system in baseball. So a challenging environment in your division competing against the Yankees, Orioles, and Red Sox. A roster that definitely is not as good as the number 5 payroll in baseball, and a weak farm system make the Blue Jays, in my mind, an interesting challenge, even though you do have pretty good financial resources and a pretty good market environment. A fifth challenging team to consider, and I don't think this one's going to surprise anybody. I believe they've been on our list every year that we've done this. The Miami Marlins, 62-100 record a year ago, 33 games out in the division. And the Marlins, similar to the Nationals, who we already talked about, have to face some pretty competitive dynamics facing off against the Mets and the Braves and the Phillies in the National League East. Pretty uninspiring roster that was not that good a year ago. And honestly, I don't feel like the Marlins have made any huge acquisitions to materially change things this past offseason. Small market size, pathetic fan loyalty, although the fan interest is actually decent. Budget and payroll, both relatively low, and as we noted earlier when we talked about Oakland, according to Spot Track, the Marlins have the lowest payroll in baseball at this point at $47.1 million. The one positive thing you can say about the Marlins in that low payroll is that they have the youngest roster in all of baseball with an average age of 28.3 years and no real significant long-term commitments outside of Sandy Alcantara, who, while he's probably not what they hoped he would be when they signed him to that extension, is still certainly a useful major league pitcher. Ownership, Bruce Sherman, pretty average for OOTP rankings. And then the farm system for the Marlins is mediocre at best. OOTP ranks them 21st. That's also where Baseball America has them with the lowest of the rankings that I looked at. Bleacher Report has them rated the highest at number 14. So seems to be a clear general consensus that the farm system overall is not all that exciting. The roster, not all that exciting. The payroll and budget, not all that exciting. And the market environment is pretty average, which is why, as always, I think the Marlins are an interesting challenge to consider playing in Out of the Park Baseball 26. And if you follow baseball at all, which you probably do if you're watching this video, you knew that this one was coming. The Chicago White Sox, coming off of a historically bad 41-121 season, are another very challenging team to consider in OOTP 26. We've already talked about the lack of talent on this roster. While the White Sox are expected to be much better in the upcoming season, their over-under is 53.5, which is still the lowest in all of baseball. So they're widely considered to remain a poor team. You do have an above-average market size, and you do have an owner who, at least according to OOTP, is pretty supportive, with Jerry Reinsdorf's tolerant patience and charitable fiscal personality. As of today, the White Sox rank number 28 in baseball in terms of their real payroll at $64.6 million. They do have the fifth youngest roster in baseball at 29.7 years. Couple of contracts that could be a concern, and they're right at the top of this list as the most expensive contracts they have. And that's Andrew Benintendi and Luis Robert Jr. Robert Jr. hasn't become the player that I'm sure the White Sox thought he might. And Benintendi definitely doesn't add a ton of value as a left fielder if he's hitting .229 with an on-base percentage below 300. So you've got a very weak roster, a low budget, and you don't have any real significant talent locked up for the long term. And those are among the reasons why the White Sox remain a very interesting challenge to consider. A seventh challenging team to consider in OOTP 26 is the Cincinnati Reds, coming off of a 77-85 fourth place finish in the National League Central. The roster is honestly kind of mixed, with Matt McClain and Ellie De La Cruz, definitely some really good young talent. Hunter Green certainly has potential, as does Tyler Stevenson. But after those four, there's a lot of meh and bad as far as your roster. A lower tier market situation with below average market size, poor fan loyalty, but decent fan interest. Cincinnati expected to be a little better this year with an over-under of 78.5. The ownership situation, not great, but not horrible. Honestly, in real life, it's probably a little worse with the Castellinis than it shows up here in OOTP, which is what we actually care about. The contract situation, not horrible. Your long-term commitments are to Hunter Green, which seems like a pretty good contract, and Heimer Candelaria, which is a bit more meh, but you're likely to move on from that after 2026, so it's not going to hamstring you horribly. The minor league situation for Cincinnati is one of the most volatile in terms of the ranking. You can see that OOTP had them ranked 7th as of the end of last year, with guys like Lauder, Petty, Burns, and Phillips, pretty prime-ranked prospects. Unfortunately for the Reds, the ratings are all over the map. The Athletic has them ranked 8th overall, which is clearly a top third farm system. But Fangraphs has Cincinnati ranked 24th overall, which is obviously a lower tier situation. So a lot's going to depend on exactly how OOTP views their prospects as this season begins. But with a roster that outside of a few guys has a lot of question marks, and a financial situation that is certainly not incredible. Right now, as we prepare for the beginning of the season, the Reds rank number 22 in their payroll at $103.6 million. So it's hard to imagine that it's going to be real easy to compete overall in the National League. They do have the benefit of being in the NL Central, which is at this point probably the place that you want to be in the National League, so you don't have to compete with those big three teams that we talked about in the NL East, the monster that is the Dodgers in the West, and then you've also got the Diamondbacks, who have a good young team the Giants, who will certainly spend some money, and the Padres, who will also spend some money competing with you in the West. So I think they're in the right division, but I still think it's a challenging situation for the Reds, given that for the time being, they don't seem willing to spend a lot of money. And eighth challenging team to consider playing in out-of-the-park baseball 26 is the Los Angeles Angels. This is one that's a bit more similar to the Toronto Blue Jays in that I think there's some really good things, but I think there's some really bad things as well with the Angels. Definitely have a mixed roster. If Mike Trout is healthy, clearly one of the best players in baseball, but a pitching staff that does not necessarily rank incredibly highly. Positively, you're in a very big market with decent fan loyalty and fan interest. You've got a big payroll, although it's listed as fourth here. Right now, in reality, it's number 10 overall at $191.8 million. Your over-under is 71.5, so you are expected to be better this upcoming season. And you've got an owner with a charitable fiscal personality in Artie Moreno, so he is willing to spend money. It's just that historically, a lot of the money that has been spent by Artie Moreno and the Angels has not been spent all that effectively. And that is one of the negatives that you're dealing with here. If Trout is not healthy, that contract is potentially disastrous. And the Anthony Rendon contract at this point is basically just setting money on fire. And anytime Rendon seems to talk to the media about how he's approaching his rehab and getting healthy, it seems to end up infuriating Angels fans even further. They did bring back Kikuchi. They signed Kenley Jansen, traded for Jorge Soler. So a little bit of supplements to this roster. But if Rendon and Trout continue to have health issues, you're going to be hamstrung financially for the next couple seasons. And then the biggest issue is that you have one of the poorest farm systems in baseball. OOTP had them ranked number 29th. And this was one where there was a lot of consensus among the rankings. Bleacher Report had them ranked 22nd, but Fangraphs, The Athletic, and Baseball America all agreed that the Angels were the 30th ranked farm system in baseball. So an owner that is willing to spend, but a very bad farm system and an aging and expensive roster make the Angels an interesting challenge to consider. The ninth challenging team to consider playing in out-of-the-park baseball is the Colorado Rockies. At 61-101, clearly coming off of a very rough season. And this is a team where it's expected to be even rougher this year. The over-under for Colorado for 2025 stands at 58.5 right now. Average market size, pathetic fan loyalty, and pretty poor fan interest. Your player payroll, according to Spot Track, as the season begins, ranks 21st overall at $112.2 million. You're tied for the ninth oldest roster in the league with an average age of close to 31. And you're also playing in a park that is very different than anyone else in the major leagues, where you're going to have to seriously think about the type of pitchers you bring on board. And if you've got a bunch of fly ball oriented pitchers who don't have great movement on their pitches, you can definitely be giving up a lot of runs. The contractual situation in Colorado is not good. Chris Bryant and Kyle Freeland are both potentially bad contracts, and Ryan McMahon and Antonio Senzatella could both be headed in a similar direction. So you don't have a big payroll, and you've got a lot of money committed to guys who are in their late 20s and early 30s who have had injury and production issues in recent years. Also, not the best ownership situation with an owner, Charlie Monfort, who's demanding and controlling. The positive thing is, at least according to OOTP, your farm system is really good, ranking first overall. The negative on that front is that when you look at the rankings from the experts as we head into the 2025 season, it's certainly not as positive. Baseball America has Colorado's farm system ranked the highest at number 13, and The Athletic has them ranked the lowest at number 23. So the consensus among those two, as well as Bleacher Report and Fangraphs, is that this is a pretty middling farm system. Actually, I misspoke. Bleacher Report has them 10th, so that's the highest rated. Fangraph has them 15th. 13th, as I said, with Baseball America, and 23rd with The Athletic. So pretty average farm system rankings overall. Probably would think they would trend towards a little higher than that, given where OOTP had them. But you are in a situation where you're competing with the Dodgers, Padres, and Giants, who all spend a ton of money. The Diamondbacks, who will spend some money and are young and good, been in the World Series just a couple of years ago. And you've got a aging roster with some bad contracts. You play in a funky park at a high elevation, and you need to do some interesting things to help ensure that your pitching staff is going to be successful. I'd recommend trying for a lot of ground ball oriented pitchers there. So the Rockies are definitely a very interesting challenge to consider playing. And the 10th and final challenging team to consider playing in Out of the Park Baseball 26 from my perspective is the team that won more games last year than any of the other 9 teams that we've talked about. And that's the 80-82 Tampa Bay Rays. A pretty mediocre roster, and a team that on the field definitely seems to be trending in a difficult direction. Like the Blue Jays, you're facing off against some of the most loaded rosters in baseball, and some franchises that have great resources and are very willing to spend them. You do have good fan interest, but a small market size with low fan loyalty. As this season begins underway, OOTP has you number 27 in payroll, and Spot Track with the real payroll also has you at number 27 with a $72.6 million payroll in Tampa. Ownership with a demanding and controlling Stuart Sternberg is not great. No horrible long-term big obligations, and you did add Danny Jansen and Ha-Sung Kim this past offseason to bolster your roster. The most positive thing you've got going for you, and it's maybe the only real positive thing that you've got going for you, because you are facing teams with many more resources and better rosters, is that you've got a good farm system. OOTP has them ranked second, and everybody that I looked at had them in the top 10. The worst ranking was The Athletic at number 9. Baseball America had them at number 6. Bleacher Report at number 2, and Fangraphs at number 1. So you should have some good talent on the way to bolster your roster in Tampa Bay. But in a division where you're always going to be competing against the Yankees and the Red Sox, the Orioles have a very good, talented, young, cheap roster right now. And the Blue Jays have more resources than 80% of the teams in baseball to spend against you. It's always going to be a challenge to compete in Tampa. And that's why I think they're another interesting team to consider playing with in OOTP 26 if you are looking for a challenge. There's obviously several other teams that I thought about putting on this list. Honestly, a lot of them are in the central divisions in both leagues. Thought about the Tigers, maybe even the Twins, but Tigers were, of course, a playoff team last year and have one of the top young pitchers in baseball. The Cubs and the Cardinals have good resources, but haven't performed very well recently. The Giants, in my mind, are kind of similar to the Blue Jays. They've got good resources, but they always seem to finish second or third when they're competing for a big free agent. So I think there's a lot of interesting teams to consider. I mentioned 10 that I thought were particularly interesting and challenging. If you have other thoughts, I'd love to hear them in the comments section down below. If there's anything that you're particularly looking forward to in the new version of Out of the Park Baseball, would love to hear about that as well. And as I mentioned, we do have our long-term simulation of the Oakland A's still going on the channel if you're interested in that. And we should be putting out some new and updated tutorial videos in the coming weeks as we approach OOTP 26 and then start playing with the new game. So thank you so much for watching, and until our next video, hope you have a great day.